had such an exceptional week. I am delighted to be hosting this exceptional event to conclude it. I'm so pleased to introduce Dr. Catherine Angel as our keynote speaker. Catherine's next book, Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again, is coming out with Verso in March 2021. She is also the author of Unmastered, a book on desire most difficult to tell, and Daddy Issues, both of which I cannot recommend highly enough. They are brave, brilliant, groundbreaking, form reinventing books. Catherine directs the MA in Creative and Critical Writing at Birkbeck, University of London, and has a PhD from the University of Cambridge. Her presentation today will examine sex, consent, and arousal through the lens of 3 films. This event will take a slightly different form to previous panels this week, which I will talk you through in a moment. First, though, I'll just give Catherine the chance to say hi.
Hello, hi. I hope you can hear me okay and see me okay. Yes, I thought I would pre-record the keynote because I was slightly anxious about connection issues and thought I wanted to ensure that you had at least a smooth kind of talk itself. So yeah, thanks for inviting me and thanks for coming and thanks Nina and everyone else. And I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, what a treat for us. Okay, fab. So I'll just talk through the strategy.
Want, or you cannot want things that your sexual partner is insisting that you should want. But they often make a kind of troubling statement, which is that you can just, for instance, through masturbation, discover your own pleasures and desires. And then you move out into the world and you say to your partner, this is how I like to be touched, or this is what I like to do. And I can completely understand the rationale for that. You know, in a world where women especially are subject to kind of a lot of coercion and persuasion and, you know, gentle nudging by men, it can be very empowering and important to come to sex kind of armed with your positions and your boundaries and your statements. But I think that's a shame, and we shouldn't accept that. That shouldn't be the horizon of our kind of sexual education. We should turn it around and say, well, why have we capitulated to this idea that you know, sexuality is a kind of like trade-off of preformed desires? Because it's also, I think, terribly what's the word, like well, not satisfying for men also to live in this situation where they're supposed to always know what they want and pursue what they want, because sexual desire for anybody can be a really you know, exciting, tremulous discovery of things that you really were not expecting. And that should be something that we should all be able to explore and experience. And, you know, and obviously it's not, you know, the book is primarily about relations between men and women, but of course these are issues that crop up in sex between anyone. And, you know, and a lot of the best writers on this, I think, are queer theorists and are gay men who have had to also contend with sexual violence and the spectre of death in all kinds of ways, and have elaborated these, you know, really beautiful ways where they're dismantling that kind of masculine ideal of self-knowledge and kind of sex as a, you know, kind of, you know, war game. So I hope that kind of answers your question.
I thought that was a great answer. I hope Tom agrees. Okay, so we have 2 more questions. We said we would end at past. We'll see where we stand after the next question. And then if people have to leave for other meetings, Tom agrees that was a great answer. Then of course that's understandable, but I don't want to cut the discussion short. I know Catherine's happy to keep answering questions for a bit longer. Daryl has a question. Go ahead.
Hi there. Thank you, first of all, for a really interesting and like enlightening presentation. So yeah, thank you. My question, you touched on towards the end of your last answer there, which is, I suppose, what happens when sort of men, to a degree, are removed from the equation, and a sort of a more queer sort of sexual experience is taking place, because I wonder whether or not there is that notion within sort of some queer discourses of like that as being a liberation of sexuality when you maybe discover that about yourself. But then I wonder whether or not kind of going too much into that idea of liberation, movement into queerness as liberation, perhaps erases some of the same concerns that then can manifest in queer sexual interactions. And I just wondered whether or not you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, that's the risk, right? That, whenever you try and kind of articulate some kind of, utopian notion of sex where we might, be able to like experience, like Bersani's kind of self-shattering and, the kind of losing sight of the self and the blurring of our own boundaries and, things that I do think are really central importance to sex, to any kind of sex. But yeah, it's very difficult because the fact is that I would imagine the overwhelming majority of, well, I know I'm not going to make that kind of claim, but for a lot of people, I think sex and the pleasure of sex is only possible actually through the opposite, right? Through a kind of management of boundaries and that sense of sort of the place where you can find some sort of autonomy or safety that feels like you're on kind of secure ground. So in other words, it's risky to idealize that sort of abandon, because abandon in sex and vulnerability in sex is something that we can all pay a really huge price for. And regardless of our sexuality and regardless of our gender, anyone can be subject to male violence. People can be subject to female violence. There's domestic and sexual violence amongst lesbian couples. It's not straightforward. And I think it is risky to kind of to lose sight of the way that's a risk for everybody. So I don't want to dismiss the kind of like the really concrete fears and actual experiences of violence that can make that sort of openness and vulnerability impossible. But I want to keep it open as a possibility, precisely because in the case of women, having sex with men, I think that we capitulate conceptually too much, and I really don't want to do that. It's like finding the balance between acknowledging that that sexual violence and that imbalances of power can make a sort of playful and vulnerable openness to sex really, really difficult on the one hand, and on the other hand trying to keep open that possibility and not just give in to this idea that we have to know ourselves and know what we want. And I think those things apply so widely. I mean, the rates of kind of coercion and violations of consent in sex between men are very high, and there are real difficulties to do with the articulation of consent according to particular norms that predominate amongst men and amongst women and in particular relationships. So anyway, I'm kind of rambling, but it's a very difficult terrain.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Okay, Catherine, are you happy to go on for another 10 minutes? Okay, I hope that people can stay with us. Thank you for these fabulous questions. Okay, we have a question from Miriam B. I was wondering what you would say about the quote unquote rough sex defense and how to navigate consent in this area. Interesting question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there was very recently a sort of a change that was being put through to try and prevent this this defence from. So the defence being that men who are accused of sexual violence, and in cases where women have been killed during sex, where the defence is that it was rough sex that kind of went wrong. I think there have been some completely egregious examples of this being used as a way to exonerate male violence, and just the classic structure repeating itself of women themselves and their own sexual desires being brought in as evidence for their own, deserving to die. I mean, it's absolutely terrible. So I'm glad that there is some change happening on that front. But I guess, this is probably something I need to think about more. So I don't know that I have a very good answer to this question, really. But it is a really complex area, I think, because sex, it's very difficult. I want to be like at pains to emphasize that I'm not taking the line that sex is weird and it's all about boundaries blurring, and therefore we don't have to think about sexual ethics and the politics of it, because there are critics of consent, for instance, who do tend to take this slightly almost like dewy-eyed, slightly nostalgic view of sex as kind of inevitably trafficking with risk and violence, and therefore if you're a proper sort of grown up, you understand that about sex, and you don't expect a legal structure or cultural norms around sex to kind of handhold you and tell you exactly how things should go. So I'm thinking of people like Laura Kipnis or Katie Voife, who have made those kinds of arguments about consent. I mean, they're not talking about rough sex in particular, but I sort of want to emphasize that I don't think that the recognition of the strange space that sex is should make us take violence off or let violence off the hook. But I do think that we don't really advance our cause, and we don't help women or anyone, in fact, having sex if we try to push out of sight the fact that sex is inherently risky. I just think sex is risky because you are vulnerable, because you have a desire, you have a longing that you want to be met. You will probably feel hurt if that desire isn't reciprocated. You are often unclothed. And in fact, whether you're unclothed or not, you have a body that can be hurt. Men's bodies can be hurt too, and their ideas about their bodies can be wounded in ways that can make them feel extremely upset and angry and violent. So, you can't remove risk from sex. And I think it's really, really important to remind ourselves of that, because the temptation is to deny that vulnerability. And I don't think that's helpful, because that tends to come back to kind of haunt women, because often they are then made responsible for their lack of adequate management of that risk. Whereas I think the risk should be acknowledged to be, much more widely shared. Like, we're all vulnerable to it. But of course, in the case of, particular sexual practices, that the closeness of sex and pleasure to pain and to danger can make this much more difficult to manage, which is why people have rightly kind of talked about how practitioners of BDSM have done really interesting and amazing work in terms of like articulating consent and talking about boundaries and agreements, and also being very upfront about what they like, which is something that perhaps also is difficult for people to do, perhaps especially for women having sex with men. But so I think some of the kind of contractual elements of sex can be really useful for precisely those reasons, that we can be hurt physically and psychologically in sex anytime any of us have sex with anyone. But obviously, that should not be used to punish women. The fact that women can be made vulnerable physically in sex is not an excuse to make them vulnerable and to make them bear the burden for harm that ensues.
Thank you. I mean, it certainly seems to me that your argument, emphasizes that, well, because there is risk in sex, that doesn't then take the well, I don't know, what I'm hearing is that, it doesn't take the responsibility, say that if you're engaging in sex, then you're at risk and you just have to accept that. Quite the opposite. It means, I think, sorry, you've articulated it far better than I could, but essentially, thank you. Okay, we have 2 final questions, and I'm going to, I think, ask them to you at the same time, and then I will ask you perhaps to email me with the names of the queer theorists dismantling masculine identity, and I can send that out so that, because Mia's asked about that. So here are our 2 final questions are, well, firstly, Christopher says, thanks for such a superb talk, which I agree with. He's curious to hear about whether contemporary incels/incelibate discourses have cropped up during your research, a sect of people who seem to consistently lack experiences/backgrounds of paternal figures. That's question number 1, which is also written in the chat. And from Erin, she says she was really struck by the idea of especially women's right to pleasure. How might we distinguish a right to pleasure from largely men's, I guess, perceived right to sex, but also from an imperative that we have to know and control our own pleasure categorically? And actually that speaks to this idea of incels, involuntary celibates, and this idea of a right to sex. Hopefully we'll be able to look at those questions simultaneously.
Yeah, I'm just looking at them again in the chat. The idea of, women's right to pleasure. Right, yeah, great questions. So incels have kind of cropped up, and there's a chapter in the book which is on theories of sexual desire, and I talk in there about this kind of new, like this research that's been conducted by sort of women psychologists in the last sort of 15 years that is kind of re-emphasizing male and female desire as very different. And so they're articulating a model of kind of women's desire as responsive. And anyway, I won't go too much into that. But so I discuss this research and its kind of virtues and its flaws. And one of the things I talk about is this idea of kind of male sexuality as, kind of libidinal, like as the definition of libido is, masculine desire, and of women as having this kind of more cognitive relationship to sex. Women weigh up sex. They agree to sex because they want other things that sex brings them, like bonding and emotional closeness, etc. And so there's this contemporary research that is sort of saying this. It's like a kind of slightly renewed version of that idea, and it's quite influenced, I think, by evolutionary psychology. And obviously, it's very dangerous to think that men have a desire that must be satisfied, and that women decide whether or not they're going to kind of give up this valuable good in order to get a husband or whatever. But that sort of ties in a lot with the incel discourse, I think. I mean, I haven't looked like really in depth at the incel stuff. I know that I think Amir Srinivasan's new book that I don't know quite when it's coming out, The Right to Sex. So she wrote this fantastic article in the LRB a couple of years ago about partly about incels and this idea of kind of the right to sex. I think she talks about this in her book. But it's it's an idea that has been with us for so long, that men have this kind of biological drive, that women also have a not just a duty to fulfill, but also a kind of self-preservational interest in fulfilling. So in fact, just the other day I saw something on Twitter or somewhere about this idea that for instance, that sex work is a necessary release valve for male aggression, and that if there weren't sex workers, men would be raping loads of women. I mean, it's so offensive on so many levels. But I think it's still really with us, this idea that that men are the sexual beings, they're the libidinal ones, and we sort of stand outside of sex, like we come in and out of sex, we take it into ourselves when it suits our other needs. And part of the argument I make in the book is that, you know, there may be empirical differences between how men and women behave sexually, but even if that were the case, we have to think about the how those differences might be like profoundly political and profoundly social, to do with how women's desire and men's desire is kind of like encouraged and elicited and embraced. And so then I kind of make the argument that this idea of responsive desire in women may not be wrong. It may be true that women's desire responds to their sexual arousal and to the context of their sex lives. But the whole point is, let's improve that context, like, rather than, you know, reify and naturalize these ideas of sexual drive. So the question of the right to pleasure, I mean, I think that's such an interesting way to put it. And I think I don't really go into that sort of directly in the book, but I mean, I think that's really an important avenue, because I think that is kind of the starkest difference in a way between how men and women are kind of socialized around sex, is that, you know, I don't think it's easy being a man, whether you're straight or gay or bisexual or whatever. Like, I think the ideals around masculine sexuality, and I say masculine, you know, because it is a kind of ideal of sort of subjecthood as well, I think they can be really punitive. And I think if men fail to live up to them, the consequences are very, very harsh. But I do think that it's sort of a given, it's taken as a given that men are going to pursue pleasure, and that's kind of okay. And I do think that is different for women, and I think it's built into so much. It's built into sex education. I mean, it's just so pervasive, and it's also, you know, it's also racialized. And I mean, the research on how much pleasure women feel they experience through sex compared to men is makes for pretty depressing reading. I mean, women generally experience higher rates of, you know, pain, dissatisfaction, anxiety, shame, etc. when they're asked about their satisfaction with sex. But those things are also exacerbated by things like education levels and socioeconomic status and race. I mean, it's very grim. It's a very grim picture. And I do think that, you know, without going down the road of a kind of sort of confidence feminism, yay, we should all be having great sex and being very confident about it, I do think that if women were entitled to move towards pleasure and experience it, and not be shamed for the mere act of pleasure being something they could pursue. You know, I would like women to be able to pursue sex for sex sake, rather than as something that has payoffs. And I think, you know, that is possible, but the discourse actually rules that out. The discourse does tend to position women as being interested in sex for reasons other than sex. And I think sex should fulfill us. Sex should make us feel amazing. It should be good. I hope that answers.
That's a great way to end. Thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you everyone for your fantastic questions. Oh my goodness, what a week it's been! What a week of panels! What a keynote it's been! Oh, I've loved it. I will now hand over to our conference committee co-chair, Christopher Griffin, who will close the event. But let's just have a silent round of applause for Catherine again, because that was really wonderful.
Thanks. I really enjoyed answering your questions.
Okay, over to Christopher.
Thanks, Nina. Cheers. I won't take long. I just thought it would, I guess, bookend or wrap up the conference. So yes, good afternoon, everybody. I'm one of the organisers of the In Crisis conference, and I suppose an acknowledgement of the diffuse and enthralling set of panels and papers and people that we've hosted this week, I just want to give a very brief speech to express the committee's gratitude to everybody involved. Most immediately, thank you, of course, to Dr. Catherine Angel for that barnstorming keynote speech and Q&A, moderated by Nina, which has given us all much to think about in regards to consent, to my mind, about incels masculinity as much as femininity and the discourses surrounding, an ethics of sexuality in discourse with, I think, neoliberalism. Relatedly, an enormous thank you to all of our panelists who this week gave us their time and energy during the corona crisis to share exciting research and novels to such a team. And it would also be remiss if we were not to acknowledge the audiences who, despite our digital conference room being potentially infinite in size, have nevertheless managed to fill it with the apt attention and exacting questions that have brought the conference to life. Without yourselves, our panelists and our keynote, not only would we have been unable to engage with some of the most pressing issues of our time and the past ripples that compose them, but we would not have been able to question to what extent and how we can actually engage with crises through the poetry, prose, film and visual art that emerges from them. So to all of you, I give our sincere gratitude and thanks. On a personal note, I'd also like to take this opportunity to express my sincere thanks and admiration to the In Crisis Conference Committee, that is Daryl Pears, Heather Booton, Guy Webster, Nina Ellis, Damien Walsh, Sam Brown, Jacob Mullen-Littman and Erin McFadyen. Now, I myself am quite a dour and reserved person, and so consequently spearheading our initial meeting back in 2019 to form the conference committee we see today was for me a challenging and unprecedented undertaking in many different respects. Since then, however, I'm very pleased to say that it's been a pleasure and a privilege to work alongside such an amiable, creative and determined group of students, scholars and artists. As you'll very well know, the COVID-19 pandemic ruled out the conference we'd planned to take place at the Faculty of English, undoing months of work and throwing our research, the lives of our loved ones and also the world at large into doubt. Nevertheless, despite the insecurity and new obstacles that have arisen, you have not deterred from picking up the gauntlet that has been thrown down and working to adapt the conference to these unusual circumstances I'm sure that our panelists, keynote and attendees have also struggled to navigate. The result of your tireless labours and our multitude of digital meetings is reflected not only in the productivity of this conference, but in the joy and gratitude I've felt in seeing it come to fruition through the presentations of our panelists, the moderation of our panel chairs, and the attendance of our audiences. I'm grateful to have met all of you. In closing, I'm slowly moving into a less unusual, but by no means future. We will maintain the connections we have formed as a committee and with those we have met this week during the conference. However, of course, the conference does not end quite here as we continue to work on the conference quarantine and ultimately depart on different paths and trajectories. I am and will remain grateful for this experience. And as we begin to countenance an emergence from one of the many crises we are facing as a generation, I wish everybody who has attended the conference nothing more than the fruit of your labours and the best of your futures. Thank you everybody for attending and take care.
Thank you all so much.